On a blazing summer afternoon in 2022, a 4-ton monster Peterbilt truck screaming down a runway at 300 miles per hour suddenly became a fireball. The driver didn't survive, but this wasn't a transportation accident. This was the end of the most insane engineering experiment ever bolted together by human hands. Why would anyone strap a fighter jet engine to a semi-truck? The question sounds like the setup to a joke, but for Les Shockley, it was the obsession that would define his life and ultimately claim someone else's. Shockley wasn't your typical gearhead. By the 1980s, he'd already made his mark in drag racing with his famous Shockley's special dragsters and funny cars. But conventional speed wasn't enough for a man whose mind operated in the realm of the impossible. While other racers were squeezing more horsepower out of traditional engines, Shockley was staring at decommissioned military hardware and seeing possibilities that bordered on madness. Born in 1944 in Galena, Kansas, Shockley grew up surrounded by mechanical possibilities. His father owned a salvage yard, and young Les spent countless hours among the twisted metal and discarded machinery, learning that anything could be rebuilt, repurposed, or transformed into something entirely different. The salvage yard was his laboratory, where he developed the mechanical intuition that would later allow him to see potential where others saw only scrap. The sound of military jets thundering overhead during training flights embedded itself in his consciousness. This was the era when jet engines were transforming everything from warfare to commercial travel, and Shockley understood that these machines represented pure, concentrated power in a way that conventional engines never could. He looked at a Peterbilt conventional semi-truck, a machine designed to haul freight across interstates at a steady 65 miles per hour, and imagined it outrunning fighter jets. The idea wasn't completely without precedent, though no one had ever attempted anything quite so extreme. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, major manufacturers had experimented with turbine-powered trucks. Boeing partnered with Kenworth to build the gas turbine truck in 1950, using a Boeing 502 engine producing 175 horsepower. Ford followed with their big red cabover, powered by a Lycoming T53 turboshaft engine. General Motors built the futuristic Turbo Titan III in 1965, powered by a GT309 gas turbine. These weren't publicity stunts, they were serious attempts to revolutionize transportation, but every experiment reached the same conclusion. Turbine engines were too thirsty and too expensive for commercial use. Les Shockley didn't care about practicality. He cared about the impossible. In the early 1980s, Shockley made the purchase that would define the rest of his life. 3 surplus Westinghouse J34 WE-48 turbojet engines, acquired from military surplus dealers for a fraction of their original cost. These weren't the refined turbofan engines found on modern airliners. They were pure 50s-era turbojets, compact, brutally loud, and built for short, high-power bursts rather than efficiency. Variants of the J34 family had powered early U.S. Navy and Air Force jets, including trainers and fighters such as the T-2 Buckeye and F-9F Panther, giving Shockley access to the same kind of raw thrust that once lived under the wings of frontline military aircraft. Each J34 engine was a compact masterpiece of 1950s engineering, roughly 14 feet long and designed to deliver around 3,000 to 3,400 pounds of thrust in afterburning form while guzzling jet fuel at an astonishing rate. With 3 of these engines mounted in the back of a heavily modified Peterbilt 359, Shockley created something unprecedented for a truck, a land vehicle driven not by torque at the wheels, but by pure jet thrust blasting straight out the back. This wasn't a turbine engine driving wheels through a transmission like the experimental trucks of the 50s and 60s. Shockwave, as Shockley named his creation, was propelled by pure thrust, like a fighter jet that happened to have wheels instead of wings. The truck retained its diesel engine for taxiing and moving around the pits, but at speed, it was the jet engines that provided all the forward motion. The engineering challenges were staggering. Jet engines produce their maximum thrust at high RPM, but they're designed to operate in the thin air of high altitude, not at sea level where the air is dense. The J34 engines were originally designed to operate most efficiently at 35,000 feet, where the air density is roughly one-quarter that of sea level. At ground level, the denser air could cause compressor stalls if the intake didn't provide smooth, laminar airflow. Shockley had to completely redesign the air intake systems to account for ground-level operation. The original J34 intakes were optimized for high-altitude flight, but at sea level, they needed modification to handle the increased mass airflow and inlet velocity requirements. Shockley fabricated new intake ducts that allowed the engines to breathe properly while mounted horizontally in the truck's frame. The fuel system was perhaps the most dangerous part of the entire build. The three J34 engines consumed approximately 120 gallons of JP4 jet fuel per run, with consumption reaching 400 gallons per mile when all three afterburners were engaged. Shockwave used pressurized fuel tanks rather than mechanical pumps. The tanks were pressurized with nitrogen to blow fuel into the engines at the massive flow rates required for afterburner operation. A failure in any part of this system could result in flameout, explosion, or both. The truck's frame had to be completely reinforced to handle forces it was never designed to withstand. The original Peterbilt frame was built to carry cargo at highway speeds, not to resist the massive thrust loads of three jet engines. Shockley fabricated a custom steel framework that distributed the engine loads across the entire chassis, essentially building a new truck around the original cab. Shockley built custom steel mounts strong enough to withstand the combined thrust, while insulating the cab from violent vibrations that would otherwise shake the truck apart. The driver's position was relocated to the front of the truck, as far as possible from the jet engines and their 2,000-degree exhaust flames. The cockpit was equipped with aircraft-style instrumentation, exhaust gas temperature gauges, fuel flow meters, engine RPM indicators, and fuel pressure gauges for each of the three engines. The driver controlled the engines through a system of throttle levers that looked like they belonged in a fighter jet, because they essentially did. When Shockwave first fired up its engines in 1984, it produced a combined thrust on the order of 10,000 pounds and a sound that could be heard for miles. With a race weight in the neighborhood of several tons, its effective thrust-to-weight ratio approached that of high-performance military aircraft rather than conventional trucks. In theory, Shockwave had enough power to accelerate from 0 to 300 miles per hour in under 11 seconds. But theory and reality are different things when you're dealing with thousands of pounds of metal, fuel, and barely controlled explosions. Shockwave's first public appearance was at the Experimental Aircraft Association's AirVenture Airshow in Oshkosh, Wisconsin in 1984. The truck was scheduled to race against a Lockheed T-33 Shooting Star jet trainer. The sight of a semi-truck keeping pace with a military jet aircraft was so surreal that spectators initially thought it was some kind of optical illusion. The truck's acceleration was violent and immediate. Unlike a conventional vehicle that builds speed gradually, Shockwave launched itself forward with the instant thrust response of a jet engine. Witnesses described the sound as like standing next to a rocket launch, and the heat from the exhaust was so intense that it could ignite grass and asphalt hundreds of feet behind the truck. The spectacular flames that extended nearly 30 feet behind each engine were actually a combination of true afterburner combustion and diesel fuel injected into the exhaust stacks specifically for show. The thick, billowing fire that crowds loved was as much theater as it was raw power. The performance was a sensation, but it also revealed the fundamental challenge of Shockwave's design. Unlike an aircraft, which can climb to avoid obstacles and has 3 dimensions of movement, Shockwave was confined to runways and drag strips. The massive thrust that made it spectacular also made it nearly uncontrollable. At speeds above 200 miles per hour, the truck became aerodynamically unstable, requiring constant corrections from the driver to keep it tracking straight. The problem was that the Peterbilt cab was never designed to operate at aircraft speeds. At 300 miles per hour, the aerodynamic forces acting on the truck were enormous. The cab created significant drag and lift, while the wheels and suspension components generated turbulence that made the truck difficult to control. The solution involved extensive modifications to the truck's bodywork. Shockley added aerodynamic fairings around the wheels, smoothed the cab's angular surfaces, and installed a massive rear spoiler to generate downforce and keep the truck planted on the runway. The modifications worked, but they also revealed another problem. At high speeds, the radiant heat from the three engine casings and exhaust backflow was so intense that the paint would literally burn off the cab. What began in Oshkosh soon became a nationwide phenomenon. By the late 1980s, Shockwave was racing everything from World War II fighters to modern jets at airshows across the country. The spectacle was always the same. Shockwave would line up at one end of a runway, the jet engines would spool up with a sound like the world ending, and then 8,000 pounds of modified Peterbilt would launch itself down the runway in a cloud of flame and thunder that left spectators speechless. But the performances took their toll on both the truck and its driver. The acceleration forces were so intense that drivers had to wear G-suits similar to those used by fighter pilots. The noise levels inside the cab exceeded 140 decibels, loud enough to cause permanent hearing damage in seconds. The heat from the engines made the cockpit nearly unbearable, requiring special cooling systems and fire-resistant suits. Shockley continuously refined the design throughout the 80s and 90s. He upgraded the fuel system for better reliability, installed increasingly sophisticated safety equipment, and added telemetry systems that could monitor every aspect of the truck's performance in real time. By 1990, Shockwave was reported to be topping 300 miles per hour at airshows, running in the same speed range as early World War II fighters like the Mitsubishi A6M0 and early Hawker Hurricanes, and nudging into the territory of mid-war aircraft such as the P-40 Warhawk. The truck's reputation grew beyond the airshow circuit. Shockwave appeared in movies, television shows, and documentaries. It inspired a generation of builders to attempt their own jet-powered vehicles, though none achieved the combination of speed, spectacle, and sheer audacity that Shockley had created. In the 2000s, Shockley introduced Super Shockwave, an even more extreme follow-up built around a highly modified 1957 Chevy pickup truck. Using three similar afterburning J34 turbojets and more refined aerodynamics, the truck was reputedly capable of peak speeds in the mid-300 mile-per-hour range, with exhaust so intense that show organizers had to manage runway placement and surfaces carefully to avoid damage behind the truck. The Shockwave trucks became legendary in the motorsports community, attracting attention from aviation engineers and physicists who were fascinated by the technical challenges Shockley had solved. The trucks represented a unique intersection of aviation and automotive technology, pushing both fields into uncharted territory. By the 2000s, the Shockwave trucks had evolved into something approaching a religion among speed enthusiasts. The original truck had logged thousands of miles at speeds that defied comprehension, racing against jets at air shows from California to Florida. Chris Darnell began driving Shockwave in 2012, taking over from Shockley as the primary pilot of the world's most dangerous truck. Darnell wasn't just another daredevil, he was a professional jet truck driver with over 2 decades of experience controlling land vehicles powered by aircraft engines. He had started his career driving jet-powered funny cars before graduating to the ultimate challenge of Shockwave. Darnell understood the unique physics of jet truck operation better than almost anyone alive. He knew that jet engines don't respond to throttle inputs the way conventional engines do. There's a delay as the turbine spools up or down, during which the driver is essentially along for the ride. He understood that steering inputs at 300 miles per hour had to be made with surgical precision, because overcorrection at that speed meant instant death. The truck that Darnell inherited was far more sophisticated than Shockley's original creation. Decades of development had transformed Shockwave into a precision instrument, equipped with data logging systems that recorded every parameter of its operation. The engines were monitored by computer systems that could detect problems before they became catastrophic. The fuel system included multiple redundancies and safety shutoffs. The cockpit was equipped with a high-strength chromoly roll cage and fire suppression system designed to protect the driver in the event of a crash. But no amount of safety equipment could eliminate the fundamental danger of what Shockwave represented. The truck existed at the absolute edge of what was physically possible, where the margin between spectacular success and catastrophic failure was measured in milliseconds and millimeters. The truck's performances became increasingly elaborate. Shockwave would race against multiple aircraft simultaneously, sometimes while performing stunts that seemed to defy physics. The crowds grew larger, the speeds grew higher, and the margin for error grew thinner with each passing year. On July 2, 2022, at the Battle Creek Field of Flight Air Show in Michigan, Shockwave was performing its signature routine, a high-speed pass down the runway while racing against aircraft. The weather conditions were perfect: clear skies, light winds, and excellent visibility. The truck had been thoroughly inspected before the performance, and all systems were operating normally. Darnell had performed this exact routine hundreds of times over his career. The procedure was standardized: line up at the end of the runway, spool up the engines to full power, release the brakes, and accelerate down the runway while maintaining precise control of a machine that wanted to become airborne. The performance included passing through a pyrotechnic wall of fire sequence that had become one of Shockwave's signature elements. At approximately 300 miles per hour, roughly halfway down the runway, something went catastrophically wrong. Witnesses reported seeing the truck suddenly veer to the right, departing the runway center line at a shallow angle. At that speed, any deviation from straight-line travel becomes a crisis that unfolds in fractions of a second. The truck's front wheels left the paved surface and contacted the grass alongside the runway, instantly destabilizing the vehicle. What happened next was inevitable. At 300 miles per hour, Shockwave had too much energy to be controlled once it left the runway. The truck began tumbling sideways repeatedly, the massive momentum causing it to disintegrate as it rolled through the grass. The JP4 fuel ignited instantly, creating a fireball that rose hundreds of feet into the air and could be seen for miles. Chris Darnell was killed instantly. The truck that had defied physics for nearly 4 decades was destroyed completely, reduced to scattered fragments of metal and memories. The investigation by the Battle Creek Police Department and federal authorities concluded that the right front tire had disintegrated catastrophically at high speed, triggering the loss of control that led to the crash. The failure was traced to the enormous mechanical stresses involved rather than any single design flaw, underscoring how even a routine component can become a critical weak point at that speed. The truck had survived crashes, mechanical failures, and countless moments when physics seemed ready to exact its revenge. It had raced against the fastest aircraft ever built and won. It had inspired a generation of engineers to attempt their own impossible projects, and it worked until it didn't.